This is Kenya's biggest conversation, the Situation Room, broadcasting on SpiceFM around the country and on SpiceFM KE on YouTube, on Facebook, on Twitter, around the world. Eric Latif, Nduoko, and CT Muga with you in the studio. And we have a guest, but before we introduce the guest, let's hear today's proverb.
Fumbo mfumbe, mfumbe mjinga, mwerevu uligangua.
In English?
Well, put a riddle to a fool, and a clever person will solve it. That is directly translated. Yes.
Put a riddle to a fool.
Yes. And a clever person will solve it.
Okay. Let's introduce our guest. Our guest is Stéphan Eloïse Gras. She is from France. She is the executive director of Digital Africa and co-founder of Africa for Tech. So something happened in 2018. The president of France, Emmanuel Macron, launched a program called Digital Africa, which was intended to support the tech industry and its ecosystem in Africa to a tune of some millions of euros, hundreds of millions of euros, 130 million to be precise, I think, of euros. And this is supporting Africa. She's here to tell us about it and to explain to us how Kenyan startups can also benefit from this. Good morning, Stéphan.
Hi, good morning.
No, I need to, it's one name, Stéphan Eloïse.
Yes, one name.
Okay. Hey, I have to say, good morning, Stéphan Eloïse.
Good morning.
Good to have you in the studio. Welcome to SpiceFM and the Situation Room.
Thank you for having me.
We call that the hot seat where you're seated because we want to warm it up for you and get to understand exactly why you've come to visit us this morning. But we'll be gracious hosts, as CT Muga will tell you many times. So we're talking about startups. And CT, let's start with your question.
What is a startup?
Great question to start with. So what we call a startup is potentially fast-growing company. So when you say startup, it means that you can start and get up very fast. And there are several reasons for that. But the main reason is technology. So most people, a lot of people would use the word startup to describe sometimes some SMEs that are starting up. But for me and for a lot of people in our ecosystem who we work with and partner with, a startup would include that tech and technological component that makes it capable of scaling up fast potentially, because thanks to technology, you can address, several geographies, you can address several kind of audience. I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. So a startup requires some specific skills, specific investment models, and that's why, it requires also a specific kind of support system.
At what point does it become a startup? Is it at the idea in the mind? Is it when you go and register a company but you have no idea? At what point do you consider one a startup?
That's also a very good question.
They're all good questions.
Let's philosophize about startup. It's a good... So most of the time, startups start with an idea. That's why we call it the ideation stage. So it's when you get the idea that you will have a product and offer a product or a service, and this product and service would be the core of your company development. And so most of the time you start getting called a startup when you have what we call the MVP, a minimum valuable product, meaning that you have a sort of prototype of something that can potentially later on scale up at some point. So I think, you are called a startup when you're an entrepreneur, you have an idea, but more than an idea, you have a product to show that your idea can answer some real people needs and, solve real world issues as well.
So if you could give an idea of who is being looked at, because obviously we're talking about the continent of Africa. So are there specific areas whereby certain companies or certain individuals are being looked to in order to offer this support?
Sure. So for Digital Africa, what we look at is startups and technological product and innovation for what we call the real economy, meaning, verticals and markets like health, education, energy, but also content, anything that actually solve a real people's problem and bring some real economy on the table. So this is what we look at Digital Africa. But you could have like some pure technological startup. So let's say, startup doing AI that can be not necessarily, that can be what we say sector agnostic, meaning that they can be present in many different words. Yeah, it's a whole vocabulary. I see you're laughing.
Yes. I'm laughing because I'm looking at the word agnostic and how it's being referenced in this discussion. Very good indeed. Yes.
So let's go back now into 2018, and the president of France decides to launch this project. Tell us about it.
So,
what was the thinking behind it, and what is the idea?
Yes, so the vision and the idea behind Digital Africa was that in order to support the incredible youth on the continent and give them opportunities, we need to support technological development and the opportunities in the ICT and tech sector. And that comes with the necessity to create jobs. And to create jobs, the vision is that we need a tech made in Africa that solves problems and issues made, for that happening on the continent, and the solution must be designed and thought and developed by the young people themselves. So that's pretty much the vision behind Digital Africa. So Digital Africa was launched in 2018 in an event in France called Vivatech with the Rwandan president Paul Kagame. And the vision and mission, therefore, is to support tech entrepreneurs in their capabilities to design and scale later on digital innovation for the real economy, which you were asking earlier. So it was initially launched with both financial capacities and non-financial capacities. So the first capacities summed up to 60. Were announced as a 65 million euros fund, but we actually reached 73 million in our development, and now we just announced that we are relaunching. A new pocket for 130 millions for the next 3 years.
Okay.
And so with that in mind, what we want to achieve is really to support both skills development and high impact digitally enabled startup or companies, early stage company. We want to source global finance to make more funds available for those entrepreneurs with great technological ideas. And we also want to support Made in Africa policies that are conducive for these technological development that the continent needs.
So let me understand this. Huh? So you fund individuals with ideas. You fund, I'm going through a list. That's list one, first item. Item number 2, my thinking. You fund projects that have started and that are technological and seem to have a promise of growing to become big. You also finance policies that lend itself to the development of ideas and things that will progress the continent.
So, yes, not exactly.
Let's start with the not exactly. That is exactly where I was going.
It's the policies,
I
Yes,
understand.
yes.
Okay.
So no, we don't fund policy. That's not how and why we were built and invented and created. What we do is we support ecosystem players in their capacities to, and that includes. So let me start with what is an ecosystem. Like an ecosystem for technological innovation and startup development requires at least 5 kind of personas, let's say. One is the entrepreneur with the great idea and vision. 2 is the investors, the one who will give him, the fuel to be able to develop the company. 3rd is support systems, so networks of incubators or accelerators. I'm sure you've seen, there's so many in Kenya, so meaning that spaces and organizations that will support a network and a community of entrepreneurs in their early stage of their company and their development. 4th is research and science. I think innovation comes from that. And the fifth kind of people that are needed to build a technological ecosystems is policymakers, because we know that without the public support for, and I'm sure you're also familiar, for example, with the startup bill that was developed here in Kenya, in Nairobi. So, and there's many other areas or ways to support technological innovation and ecosystem development for innovation. So one of the first countries that did that in Africa is Tunisia. Tunisia was the first back in 2018 to create a startup act, meaning that because a startup, as we were discussing earlier, requires some specific skill set, some specific investment, some specific support system, we need to a whole village to build that and to allow that to grow.
Okay, so I'm a startup, and there are many. So, as an example, if I'm a startup, how do I then find you? How do we come to a central place? Do we send applications? So individuals or companies or startups, as you say, how do they know how to get in touch with you and then start to be able to access this support?
Yes. So we are backed by what we call a development fund, meaning the French Bank for Development, so DFIs in the acronym. So what we do, DFIs are it's a sort of like tricky thing to say we're gonna have like one central place and with open desks for that, which is something that I wish we could do, but let's face the reality, it's not happening. But what we managed to do with Digital Africa, and I think that really something that could be a change maker, we offered some online capacities for startups and entrepreneurs with ideas and products that are already, in development stage, to test their eligibility to some of our funds. So, for example, during the COVID pandemic, we realized that, a startup, when I was saying, needs different stage of fundings. You can go from like what we call the early stage funding, which means that when you start, you have an idea. You need, what we call seed money. So most of the time, people will get money from their friend, from their family, but it's really hard to get a loan, especially on the continent. We know that. So lots of that money is like small grants with different levels. Then you have like what we call the seed fund, meaning that there you can start talking to some business angels, maybe some early stage investors who will support you with more money. And then when you start growing, you have hired a team, you'll need to grow and expand because, the bottom line is really create jobs and make sure that the companies are sustainable. Then you will also address other kind of investors, which we called venture capitalists. Okay. So at Digital Africa, what we did during the COVID-19 pandemic, we launched a fund that support startups between 2 rounds of fundings, meaning that they can, because the pandemic made it harder for individuals and startups to, access to money, and especially from the investment sector. So what we did is offer them some specific kind of loans that could make them, have a little more time and space between 2 rounds of funding. And this fund, called the Bridge Fund, was made accessible thanks to a website where entrepreneurs could come and test their eligibility. If they were eligible under certain criteria, we would then give them a certain, because then you have to do all the technical work and paperwork to look at how the money can be brought to the entrepreneurs. Right. So we managed to shorten that investment cycle, meaning that, most of the time, as I was saying earlier, DFIs can take years to give access to the money. There we managed to shorten that to a couple of months. So for us, this is the direction that we want to take with Digital Africa. And we are now preparing some more funding capacities for startups to be able to access to. I want to mention one thing that most of the time the way you can access to, and that's important for some of your auditors maybe, the way you can access to funding is through incubators or accelerators that are themselves funded by some organization like ours or like other organizations and DFIs. You can have access to funding through investors, so early stage investors and venture capitalists. So this is how you should start as an entrepreneur, is really identifying, you have your idea, you have your product, at least a prototype of your product, and you want to grow it, you want to be able to start hiring people. What you do is you go to some organization and investors. Most of the time, investor will ask you to show some revenue already. So, be aware, and I am fully aware of that. I used to be an entrepreneur myself, so it's really a tough moment. You will have to, you will fail many times.
It works.
Yes.
That this is a business that functions.
Yes.
And is already making money.
Yes.
But now, with the case of Digital Africa, when you say that you're funding, what does funding mean? Is it free money? Is it a loan? Is it an investment in exchange for some equity into the business?
So you have indeed different kind of funding, let's say financial tools. So one is 0% loans, meaning reimbursable loans. The other could be grants, so indeed free money. What we're looking at now, and this is something that will be new and probably also a game changer, is how can we offer convertible notes. So, for example, you basically lend some money, but instead of asking it back with 0% rate or the rate, you can turn it into equity, convert it into equity. That's what we call it. Convertible notes. Then you have other kind of participation, which are shares or equity, and that is for later stage startup that will already have some like capital and that are already funded. So we at Digital Africa do not focus only on funding. We also focus a lot on like supporting the startup, because funding is important, yes, but to be able to get funding, you need to have to show that your product is interesting, that it's solid, that it's built, that you have a strategy, you have a plan, and all that requires skills, require an understanding of your markets, and let's say you want to design a specific mobile app for getting to know whether you have COVID or something else. Something that is quite necessary today. I'm sure there's lots of people with ideas like that. You need to show that you need someone to design your app. You need to build your strategy. You need to make sure that you have the right logistic behind it. So all that calls for non-financial support as well. And this is where we also have our focus on.
What I'm interested in knowing, I get the funding bit. How then do you ensure that the person who is funded actually does what they say they're going to do?
That's a really good point. When you fund early stage startup, you are expecting lots of startup to fail, because the truth is there's many ideas, there's many things to be done and to be brought to the world to solve real world challenges. Most of them will fail. So what we look at is not only, of course there's an accountability phenomena, but that's why what we call the early stage funding is a lot of grant and so far, sort of free money, because you don't expect necessarily the people to succeed 100% for sure. We wish it was possible, in an ideal world, but that's not how it works.
See, what I ask the question is, the fact that somebody has an idea, the fact that they see themselves as an entrepreneur, doesn't mean they understand how business is actually conducted or done. So I'm asking, does this enterprise, Digital Africa, do they have a hand-holding enterprise where somebody is walked through? Because if you walk someone through, I'm calling it hand-holding, you will limit these numbers of failures, because guaranteed, if the hands are not held, they will fail. Good idea is just one thing.
Yeah.
A business that actually works, a completely different thing.
Absolutely. I fully agree with you, and so that's why we need local partners. We need local presence, and we need people. That it's a whole network. So what we're doing at Digital Africa is two things. One, we establish with local partners, and we're about to launch what we call a connectors program. So it's people who are inside ecosystems, who are themselves entrepreneurs, who have succeeded a little bit, and who can, sort of tell us and confirm, A, what do local ecosystem need to be able to really grow their innovation? B, who are the startups that are, really accountable for what they say they will do, as you say, and, who are the great people, because it's all about people in the end, it's about finding the right people.
Okay.
And the second thing that we do at Digital Africa to also find that is through data. I'm sure you can imagine that when an individual, an entrepreneur, most of the time a successful entrepreneur has failed many times in the past. So what we need is to see who have applied already to some existing programs, whether for skill development and, capacity building, for getting trained as an entrepreneur, for having access to fundings. So all that is also useful data for us to be able to provide better opportunities and make sure that they are useful and efficient.
We're having a conversation with Stéphan Eloïse Gras. She is the director of Digital Africa, a program that was launched by President Emmanuel Macron of France, which is supporting African startups. She's also the co-founder of Africa for Tech. So we are discussing that. So what kind of support is Digital Africa offering to startups in Africa, and how can Kenyan startups then benefit from this? What does it mean? How can you apply? How can you benefit? What are the transparency and accountability mechanisms in place for this?
Does Digital Africa have an understanding of the market on the continent so as to understand how to apply this support best? And that's the first part of that question. And then to look at the strong ties, obviously, between Francophone Africa and Paris, whereby we have on one hand, until the very, very, very recent past, a lot of the reserves in Paris come from 8 Francophone West African countries. And here we are, on the other hand, offering support to local business. Where is the middle ground here? And is there a real understanding of what's happening on the ground business-wise to then be able to offer this support?
Thanks. That's two very good questions, and also tough. I won't lie. But no, when it comes to understanding startups' needs across the continent, and most likely also in Francophone Africa, we do have an approach looking at, sort of bottom-up approach, and make sure that through ecosystem players, we can have a better understanding of what is needed locally, whether it's like more funding, more skills, more support toward, startup acts and all these conducive action for made in Africa technology. So with this bottom-up approach come through partnerships with local players, but also aggregating data about, what is going on, what people need. And some interesting piece of data to answer your second question is that up to date, so the startup ecosystem across the continent is raising quite some money. I mean, it has reached some milestones. In 2019, it raised over $2 billion in, on the whole continent. And for this year, it is said to be that it will reach more than 4 billion. So it's growing. But 80% of that money, of these fundings and investment capacities coming from, everywhere in the world, are going through to 4 different countries, which are South Africa, Egypt, Kenya, and Nigeria. So, of course, at Digital Africa, we also have that same sort of, let's say, bias. Or is it a bias? The ecosystem is just stronger in Anglophone countries today. So at Digital Africa, with the 73 million euros fund that we funded in the past, we funded approximately up to date, because we still have programs going on, but indirect, like money going to startups, over 60 startups. And a lot of them are in Anglophone Africa. I think 10 of them are in Kenya, for example. So this is, fact. Then coming to Francophone Africa, yes, we need to support the whole ecosystem, as I was explaining earlier. So that goes with, money going to incubators and money supporting local players. We don't, the proportion of what we invest directly and give access to entrepreneurs has to be also balanced with how you support the whole, players locally. So I think that's what we notice in Francophone Africa is that there's still, for several number of, let's say, structural reasons, meaning that the economy, the way the markets are deploying, the complexity of the regional markets, and in Francophone Africa, where we are still funding more early stage, even more early stage than in Anglophone Africa. And what makes an investment, less risky, it's when you come to later stage, because obviously you already have investors putting money on the table. So that, the more people support an individual and a project and a vision and a product and a company, yes, the most chance you have to succeed. So when it comes to early stage, you are definitely funding more failures. So for now in Francophone Africa, we are looking at designing a specific tool for financing that very early stage, which won't be necessarily just focused in Francophone Africa, because the truth is there's also needs in a lot of Anglophone countries to have access to that seed money or early stage money. But the product will not necessarily be loans with or investment directly. We are looking at how we can build accompaniment, so some support system combining, yes, access to money, but also
So a complementary
complementary approach with like skills building and developing, access to support systems such as incubators and accelerators.
Looking at the 73 million euros that you were able to finance in that initial stage, how much of that has gone into free money, whatever aspect,
Yes.
and how much of it has gone into equity, where Digital Africa then has a stake in an organization that's
Yes.
currently thriving?
So the Digital Africa is being funded by the AFD Group, the French Bank for Development. So over the 65 million that were committed for the last 3 years, 50 million were handled and were actually put through investment money by Proparco, the subsidiary of AFD that handles the private sector and therefore equity and, supporting those kind of financial products. The free money part was only 15 million euros that went to approximately lots of 70 structures, both startups and incubators. So we supported a network of incubator in Francophone Africa through Afriquinov, and we supported AfriLab, which I'm sure you're also familiar with. And we supported 4 different local VC that were the one who actually gave access to those 0% loans that allowed some entrepreneurs to have access to grants from 15,000 euros to 50,000 euros, let's say. And those players were the one making the decision also. And we, Digital Africa, provided, some funding capacities, of course, and all the brand marketing, sourcing, and animating all that. But we are looking to work a little differently for the next couple of years, which also explain why we announced this renewed commitment, but also a change in our organization. We want to revamp Digital Africa and to make it even more capable of building that support system coming from, let's say, free money and grant money, but also equity and skills. So we are joining forces with Proparco now, whom we worked with at putting together the bridge fund that I was explaining at the beginning of our conversation.
Yeah.
So the idea is really we can build a sustainable pipe and opening up as many opportunities to, the entrepreneur that needs the support.
As possible. I want
yes.
to ask then, following
Yes.
into that question,
Okay.
how many of the companies that you have supported so far with the 73 million, let's even talk about the 50 million where Proparco has equity, how many of those are 100% owned by Africans? 100% of its owners without Proparco are Africans.
So what do you mean by owned?
Owned, like the shareholders.
So
where the
this-
shareholders are African and there's no, external shareholder who's come in, let's say some French guy who's also part of the shareholders of this organization before the Popacor and Digital Africa came in.
So I think this is a question for the whole startup ecosystem globally. Like most startups in France, in Europe, or in other countries in the world are not 100% national. I used to work for a startup in France called Open Classroom. It was co-founded by two young French men, but their capital was a majority of US funds, So I think we need to look at that issue globally. Like, is it a good thing to think that a company and a startup that requires lots of skills and lots of investment, because the truth is that it does require lots of capitalization, is only like sort of national based, or like has only like local national money? Is it possible even? I'm not sure. I can't answer that. What I know that our vision at Digital Africa and what we stand for is what we want is a value that is created to be kept locally in Africa. So that means 80% of the jobs should be in Africa, run by African teams. So that's for sure. Then when it comes to the co-founding teams, yes, I mean, we support African, made in Africa tech. So we want co-founders to be African as much as possible. Some of them will come from diaspora. Some of them are repats coming back to Africa. Some of them might be US or European. What we want is at least one co-founding member to be
a local.
based. Yes.
And holding a significant stake. Of course, why I'm asking this,
Yes.
Stéphan, Eloïse, because it's a conversation that has happened very many times when you look at the startup ecosystem. And there's always going to be a white head somewhere in the mugshots.
Yeah.
And you ask yourself, so why are we calling them African startups?
So I think there's white heads in Africa, that are Africans.
Yes, that's true. That's very true.
Touche. Okay.
Indeed.
But I mean, where I'm heading here is, yes, I think indeed it's a real issue, and we are aware of that. I think the bias in the startup ecosystem is not only about color, it's about also gender, it's about so many things. It's like highly unequal. Like, of course you need to have an MBA or degree to convince an investor that you are
You can run a
sustainable.
business.
So all these biases are also global. It's like it's worldwide. Believe me, I'm a woman in the tech sector. I know about that.
Sure, but if I can jump in there, Stéphan, just kind of going off what Eric says, it kind of gives the impression every time that without the presence, then this startup will not be able to run on its own. That the presence of Whitehead, as you say, then guarantees that there will be, the proper running of this organization.
Probably the same way it's, we see more male founders than female founders being funded. So I'm striving for changing that, really. And I think that I really think that what we need, and there's actually success stories that are starting. Look at Shippercash, for example. Look at, like companies. And I think that the most success stories, the first success stories won't be perfect. But as soon as we can have that open conversation and that the founding, members of the ecosystem can be asked that question and like held accountable for, be aware of that, then yes, over the years it will change, because I strongly believe that an ecosystem it's a community. You don't get successful just on your own. You need a whole community. You need a whole support system. And so yes, we do need to advocate for around all these issues and make the change happen over the next couple of years.
What does success look like? I mean, this investment program, that's what I'm going to call it. It sounds really good. The motives sound really noble. Now, startup gets moving, gets funded, it is successful. What does it look like?
So, are you asking for what success look like for
Yes,
for Digital Africa or for all the ecosystem?
Nope. Digital Africa. And that is part one of the question. There's a part two. Yes, so let's deal with part one first.
So for me, success, and for Digital Africa and all the team at Digital Africa, I forgot to mention that we have teams in Tunisia, in Kigali, and Dakar, and Paris, obviously, and also Marseille. So for all the team and at Digital Africa, what we want African brands in technology, bringing technological solutions, becoming global references. That's what we think is, will make and will address all these issues that we were discussing earlier.
Okay.
We need more diversity in tech. We need more inclusive technology, and we need to support that. To also look, I don't believe that the model for the Silicon Valley model is completely efficient and delivering the promise that it had on its early years. Although there is some amazing, startup stories and there have been some quite interesting successes.
Yeah.
But look at, the issues around social media, Facebook, and all this vision of technology is no longer sustainable. A. B, also technology is lots carbon consuming. Lots energy consuming. So yes, we do need to bring a more diverse pool of solution to the world. So for us, success look like that. What is
Okay.
your other question?
My other question, part 2, now that you've asked me that question, there'll be a part 3. Part 2 is, do we have these success stories on the continent that you can say, this organization represents the success story that we're talking about?
So yes, for me, what we saw in the fintech sector in Africa, it is something that is really truly inspiring. Because fintech, when you look at M-Pesa, which started here, M-Pesa was a global wave. It was like nobody had thought how big it could become, and nobody had thought how life-changing it would be for millions of people across the continent. So what happened with fintech, I'm not saying that all the fintech sector is perfect and but the success stories, some success stories in the fintech sector, such as Paystack, that was acquired by Stripe. So Paystack is a Nigerian company, and they really, we know the guys. They are supporting their ecosystem locally. They've been really helpful to local businesses. So that's the kind of success stories that I would, love to see happening in other sectors than fintech. Let's say in health, in education, in the content industry also, because we don't want, just Netflix and Spotify and global platforms, and they can't address, what local young people want to listen to, want to hear, what the story they like to hear or they need to hear, and nobody does, only local entrepreneurs do.
Stéphan, Eloïse, I like the way you think, but you see the third part of my question is...
Oh, you were not kidding.
No, I wasn't kidding at all. It sounds like this, People who already have these sort of businesses in the West have understood that there's a huge market on the continent. My thinking. So because there's a huge market, how do you ensure you actually benefit from this market? You have the money. You have lots of it, in fact. So invest in startups. You have an idea. You've done this thing before in your country, in your backyard. But on this continent, there are brains that can come up with these things. So you partner with them. I am thinking. So on the one hand, it's a good thing because it's helping the continent understand and realize its potential. But on the other, it's simply expanding an existing market in the West.
Well, probably, but not so true for now. I think one of the key is we need to convince the private sector in Africa to invest in its own startup ecosystem. We do need to fund startups also with capital coming from Africa. And I think that's a major thing to unlock to fully allow the ecosystem to grow and reach the potential that it needs, So I think, to your point, yes, obviously, and the same thing happened in Europe. Look, honestly, Europe has a lot of brain drain and had a lot of brain drain toward US for the tech company. And, the best developers, the best mathematicians all went to work at the GAFAM, the big tech giants. And Europe is also not so good at scaling tech. I mean, I'm sorry to say, but like we don't really have like major exit and success stories when it comes to global platforms and technology. So I think it's really about being able to bring more diversity and in the game, and I think that will require a whole let's say 360-degree approach, working around skills, working around funding, and that's why we want to source global funding, finance, but also African finance. Like, yes, the private sector in Africa needs to invest in its own technology and its own startup ecosystem. Some already does, like some African banks are actually funding lots of, startups and supporting them, but not enough, obviously.
Not enough. Maybe that's the place where policy and government comes in, because then if a government has decided that it has a policy, it has a law, let's say let's start a bill that is being produced and going through Parliament. If such were in place, such that they safeguard, even when we say that this is a startup that started in Kenya, then how does it develop outside of the country? If it moves into another country, we know that it's registered and its home base is Kenya, not the other way around, where you find that a startup could, start in Kenya, but then at some point it starts growing, it goes to Series B, it goes into some financing, it changes its location to another country, a tax haven or a European capital, where then it becomes no longer a Kenyan company. We need to look at very many ways of safeguarding that, which is where I see where Citi is asking. Because if with all these kind of funds coming in, these entrepreneurs have their personal interests, and also governments also have their interest. And the interest would be come and mine the opportunities in terms of the human capital that's there, in terms of the ideas that are there in Africa. And then when they start thriving, by the time we realize this thing started here, it was incubated on Gong Road, but it's not a Kenyan thing. It's actually registered somewhere in Paris. Do we have, apart from the ones that you've given us, Paytech and M-Pesa, do we have cases where we can see this is a startup that is a true African unicorn?
I just mentioned Paystack.
Minus those two.
Okay. No, I mean it's true that it's not enough for now. But at least it's starting, and the possibility when one makes the possibility happen, then it means that others can. And you may call me an idealistic or
it is good to be idealistic.
But I really support the idea that once one thing happens, then the change can follow up. So yes, I fully agree with all you've said, and I think we need to make those success stories be even better than their peers and their previous success.
So what's in it for the government of France? Why support this? Why spend 73 million shillings in Africa? Why spend an extra 130 million euros, not even shillings, euros in Africa? What's in it?
So it's very much about first, let's say we have the development money, Development money has reached also a moment in history of public development money, I think. And they are, struggling to change and to, sort of adapt to this new world. And I think so that's for sure the first reason. The second reason is we do need jobs in Africa. We do need young people in Africa to find opportunities. Because the truth is, by 2035, almost 40% of the population in age of working in the workforce is in Africa. So we are completely depending on what's going to happen on the continent over the next couple of decades.
Okay. So then the final question. Of all the organizations that you've supported so far with the 73 million euros, right? How much of that money has gone into French companies? And this is by saying, so you're supporting, for example, incubator, accelerator. How many of them have some connections to France?
So you're asking for the supporters, or you're asking for the entrepreneurs?
I'm asking where the money is going, How
No.
much of it is actually
Yeah.
landing in Africa, in Kenya, and
Yeah.
supporting Kenya and staying in Kenya? And how much of it is coming that, there's an organization that has been set up here, it's an accelerator, but the accelerator is actually a French company that is supporting to, start the startups in Kenya?
So in Kenya, 100% of the startup we supported are Kenyan. Like, we don't support because, let me explain that it's also a sort of like institutional thing. We have another organization in France called BPI, the Public Bank for Investment, that support French startups who want to come to Africa. It's their business. It's the Public Bank for Investment in France. What we're doing is supporting startups in Africa, African co-founders, African jobs on the continent. So that's the bottom line for Digital Africa.
Okay.
And yes, we have supported indirectly a couple of like French players who are on the continent, let's say VCs. So for example, Investment and Partners, Investissement et Partenaires in Western Africa. We have supported some, but very like a handful.
Okay.
And those guys are actually, the one working to support African entrepreneurs.
Okay. Stéphan and Eloïse Gras, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having
And
me.
all the best as you continue with the work that you're doing at Digital Africa. And we look forward to seeing more and more success stories coming out of Africa from the efforts. And it's good to be an idealist as well.
Yes.
It's good because you have passion for it, and that's why you're pushing it.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Come again soon.
Bye.